Hi everyone, and welcome to this short educational video about informed consent in biobanks. Until the mid-20th century, there were no laws regarding research with human participants. This led to a lot of unethical studies. Most of you probably know about the scientific research Nazis performed on minorities in the Second World War. The trials that followed these experiments resulted in the Nuremberg Code, a set of rules stating how to deal with human participants. Another study that has been very important in the history of informed consent is the Tuskegee syphilis study. In this study, African American men were infected with untreated syphilis. Most of them died, and the White House responded to this by introducing the Belmont Report. Together with the Declaration of Helsinki, these three reports comprise the rules of how to deal with humans in scientific research. Nowadays, every participant has to give consent for the collection and use of their research data. This is called an informed consent, and the three most important elements of informed consent are disclosure, capacity, and voluntariness. So a researcher has to supply all necessary information to the participant. The participant has to be mentally and physically capable to make a reasonable judgment about participation, and the participants cannot be forced to participate. Okay, so that seems easy. A potential participant gets all the information about the study that he needs to make an informed decision. If someone decides to give consent, they can participate in a research study. If they don't, the researcher has to find a different guinea pig. But there are research areas where things are less straightforward as they seem. Let's take a look at biobanks. In biobanks, participants donate a lot of personal data. All this information is stored somewhere, and researchers can request to use it for specific studies. This can be a problem for informed consent. Officially, a participant has to know exactly what a researcher wants to study before giving their consent. But in biobank research, the specific studies are unknown at the time of data collection. Can a participant then still make an informed decision if he decides to participate? There are a lot of different opinions about this. And the result of all these different opinions is that there are currently 5 types of informed consent. We have blanket consent, a participation pact, broad consent, dynamic consent, and meta-consent. They all vary in the amount of information the participant gets and the amount of autonomy he has. Each one has advantages and disadvantages. Let's first give you an overview of the main differences between the 5 types of consent. The broadest one, which gives participants the least amount of information, is called blanket consent. Then, ranked according to how specific they are, we get participation pact, broad consent, dynamic consent, and meta-consent. Blanket consent is an open consent. Participants give consent once for all future uses of their data. They have the right to withdraw, but they cannot specify what kind of research they would be willing to participate in. The biggest advantage is for the biobank. It's very easy and accessible to use blanket consent. Biobanks only need to contact participants once. A disadvantage is that participants receive no information about what exactly will happen with their data. It thus seems that an important aspect of consent, disclosure, is not met in blanket consent forms. This is the biggest critique of blanket consent. Because of this lack in information, participants are not autonomous. Other researchers, however, claim that participants exercise their autonomy because they deliberately choose to sign a blanket consent. The participation pact is also a blanket consent, but in this case the researcher or a biobank employee also signs the consent form, signaling trust. So the participant is not informed any better, but the consent form is more like a contract between participant and researcher. This increases the trust participants have in biobanks, making them feel more empowered and autonomous. In broad consent, participants still give consent only once. However, usually the scope of the research is determined, so participants are broadly aware of what the biobank studies will be about. There are three important aspects in broad consent: autonomy, minimal risk, and practicalities. All these aspects have arguments for and against them. The lack of specific information would lead to a lack in autonomy, like with blanket consent. However, according to some informed consent experts, participants ensure their autonomy in deliberately choosing to sign a broad consent. Researchers also claim that broad consent in a biobank is permissible because biobank research poses little risk to the participants. It is indeed true that there is little risk of physical or mental harm as a direct result of the studies. There is, however, a different risk. This is related to information. Even though there is low physical risk, data leaks or hacks could pose a big risk for privacy of the participants. Finally, people argue for broad consent because it's very practical. Participants only have to give consent once, requiring less time and effort from both participants and biobank employees. But broad consent shares one very big problem with blanket consent. Participants still don't get specific information about the studies they participate in. Dynamic consent is even more specific. It includes an online platform where participants can indicate their preferences. Every time a new study arises, participants can decide whether they give their consent for this specific study or not. This has a few advantages. It could be easier to recruit and obtain participants because there is less need for personal contact between the biobanker and the participants. Participants also have more autonomy because they are fully informed and can choose exactly the studies they wish to participate in. It's also a way to ensure less attrition of participants, which is vital for longitudinal data collections like most biobanks are. Disadvantages are mostly related to two things. First, dynamic consent is based on electronic communication between participant and biobank. For some groups, for instance elderly or people who do not own computers, this could be problematic. If researchers exclude these groups from their research, this could impact the validity of the studies. A second problem for dynamic consent is that the participants are contacted more often. This can also be a reason for participants to drop out of the biobank. Meta-consent is a relatively new form of consent. In this form of consent, participants decide how they want to consent to biobank research. They can choose what type of consent they would prefer to give, for what type of data, and for what contexts. This is a way to ensure a completely individual consent procedure. The participant can choose how often he wishes to be recontacted. Because participants are completely free in their individual choices, they have more autonomy. Biomedical research is developing constantly, and meta-consent could be a way to deal with this. Participants can indicate if they want to change their broad consent if the scope of the research changes too much. A disadvantage is that it bears a lot of extra costs for the biobank. It's the question whether this new type of consent is worth this extra burden when the consent type that biobanks currently use is ethically valid. In general, participants tend to favor a broad consent. They don't feel the need to give consent for every new study. Now that you've heard the different arguments, which type of informed consent do you think is the best for both biobanks and participants?